There are many theories, and I'm sure you have yours as you've often discussed, as to why JFK had to be removed. But this one to me has always been the most logical. And as Jen often likes to say, who had the most to gain? Well, this will explain.
1963. President Kennedy sent his 8th letter demanding Israel open its nuclear facilities. 5 months later, he was dead. John Fitzgerald Kennedy became America's youngest elected president on January 20th, 1961. He was 43 years old, Catholic, charismatic, and determined to reshape America's future. Within months, he launched the Peace Corps, pledged to put a man on the moon by decade's end, but behind closed doors, Kennedy was fighting battles most Americans never knew about. In 1961, U.S. intelligence discovered Israel was building a nuclear reactor at Dimona in the Negev Desert. Kennedy was alarmed. He wrote to Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, demanded inspections, transparency. Ben-Gurion deflected, claimed it was for peaceful purposes only. Kennedy didn't believe him. Between 1961 and 1963, Kennedy sent multiple letters, each one more forceful than the last. He threatened to reconsider the entire U.S.-Israel relationship if inspections weren't allowed. In May,
this is a very important point. And the fact that there is well-documented evidence that the relationship between the United States and Israel was basically hanging by a thread due to the fact that Kennedy was trying to end the Cold War, and he understood the ramifications of what Israel was attempting to do with the Greater Israel Project, which was always on the table, which is why less than 4 years after he was assassinated, you had the Six-Day War, you had the USS Liberty attack, what was supposed to be the next Gulf of Tonkin incident, which happened less than a year and a half after he was assassinated. It's all too obvious to me, Ken, that if you can point the silver bullet in one direction, and only one, because there were multiple parties involved in JFK's removal, it would seem to me that Israel had a heavy hand in making sure that that was done. Your thoughts?
Well, when you look at, there's two interesting things. One is there's mountains and mountains of assassination literature developed over decades. You know, you could stack the books literally to the ceiling, multiple conferences per year. And you're allowed to talk about the Cubans being responsible. You're allowed to talk about organized crime being responsible. You're allowed to even talk about the CIA being responsible. Some people have even mentioned the French because they had a grudge against Kennedy over Algeria. You're allowed to talk about that. Nobody has been allowed to talk about another party that you just mentioned, Israel, and the Zionist mafia, if we call it that. And what's interesting about all these other groups that you're allowed to talk about, like the CIA, like the Cubans, like organized crime, those organizations were infused with Zionists, believe it or not. James Angleton was a Zionist. The Israelis said he was the biggest, most important Zionist in America. I mean, how much more do we need to hear? And he was the head of counterintelligence for the CIA, an extremely important and secretive position in the CIA, where you're pretty much allowed to do what you want as long as you're moving the agenda forward. They don't watch too closely what the director of counterintelligence does. And if you want to test that, go to Google and ask who the director of counterintelligence is today. That man, whoever has that position now is an anonymous figure, and that he was an anonymous figure during the Kennedy assassinations. So think about that. So he was a Zionist. We often think of the Italians as being the organized crime geniuses in America, and they were certainly the biggest, highest profile. But the geniuses of organized crime in the United States were largely Jewish gangsters. Meyer Lansky being the one most people are familiar with, but believe me, the Pritzkers in Chicago, man, they laundered more money, and they got away scot-free. Lansky, everyone mentions his name, but the Pritzkers got away with it a lot. And then even when you talk about the Cubans, the Cubans did a lot of dealings with the mafia, obviously, organized crime, and the CIA. And there was Israeli and Zionist money in the Cuban casinos, and they were very annoyed when they were thrown out of Cuba. So everywhere you look, there are Zionist elements, and yet you're not allowed to talk about them, and you're certainly not allowed to talk about the facts. These are facts, by the way. This is not some conspiracy theory. The reason people haven't heard about the battle that John F. Kennedy was waging against the Zionist extremists of Israel is all those documents were classified until relatively recently, which is why I put the book together. When I discovered these documents, and I'm not like a great researcher, but somebody pointed them out to me that they exist.
Don't be so modest. You did a very good job.
Someone else told me about them, and I read them, and I said, "My God, why didn't I know about this?" And he said, "Well, look at the dates. They didn't get declassified until the 21st century." And then I started digging into it, and wherever you look, there's a lot of Zionist influence, and probably the most, maybe not the most damning evidence is Angleton, James Angleton, head of director of counterintelligence. There was a man that he worked with in Israel who posed as an international lawyer, and he probably was an international lawyer, traveling back and forth between Tel Aviv and Washington, D.C. all the time. And Angleton tasked this man with reading Lee Harvey Oswald's mail starting in 1959. All right. So remember, the assassination was in 1963. Nobody heard of Lee Harvey Oswald until then, but somehow Angleton, the arch Zionist in America, knew who he was and tasked basically a Mossad operative or agent or officer, I don't know what, to track and keep an eye on Oswald. That fact was kept completely hidden and redacted until the early 21st century. And it's like, why keep that man's name secret? And it's obvious the real secret they've been trying to keep all these decades is the heavy hand that Israel had played in the assassination of Kennedy. Now, of course, we don't know because we haven't had a full investigation and a full trial, and we're probably never going to have those things. But if you're an investigator, let's say you're a police investigator, you look at, as what pointed out Jen earlier mentioned, who had a motive? If somebody dies, you're looking around saying, well, who benefited from this guy dying?
And on that note, let's continue the video.
1963, Kennedy wrote his strongest letter yet. 2 weeks later, Ben-Gurion abruptly resigned. Meanwhile, Kennedy was battling other powerful forces. After the CIA's failed Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, Kennedy told a top official he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. He fired CIA Director Allen Dulles. And on September 12, 1962, at Rice University, Kennedy delivered his famous moon speech. We choose to go to the moon in this decade not because it is easy, but because it is hard. The world was changing, and Kennedy was at the center. November 22, 1963, Dallas, Texas. Kennedy was assassinated. Lyndon Johnson became president. The pressure on Israel's nuclear program quietly disappeared.
There you go. And a lot of people are not aware, as I was not aware until I looked into it, that Lyndon Johnson was a Christian Zionist from a Christian Zionist family. His aunt, I believe, was the head of the Zionists of America branch for her region of Texas. How can we have lived so long and read so much history and not known of this man's ideological background? And of course, you mentioned the murder of the naval personnel on that ship, the USS Liberty, and Johnson just sat back and said, "Fine, we're fine with it. We're not going to make a big deal about it." And he's also the one who basically let Israel develop the nuclear weapons. In addition to JFK going after the nuclear weapons program, he tasked his brother Robert F. Kennedy with going after the failure of Zionist influence groups to legally register. And that's another area that Johnson just couldn't care less, let it go by. And then that became the standard for all presidents following them. So yeah, it greatly benefited Israel that both Kennedy brothers were gone. And one thing LBJ did, the U.S. had given what they call defensive weapons to Israel. Of course, that's, what's a defensive weapon? But it was Johnson that gave full bore offensive weapons to an enormous degree. I mean, he completely changed the U.S.-Israel relationship regarding military aid dramatically, radically. So he was the best thing. He was the best thing that ever could have happened to Israel.
I definitely agree. And the more I've studied LBJ, the more I question who was the worst president of the 20th century. Was it Woodrow Wilson or was it LBJ? It really is 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. Although I would definitely say that FDR does not get enough criticism for some of the things that he did, in particular when it came to the gold standard. And that's a whole other story. But the one thing that I recognize throughout history is that when you get close to greatness, like we did with JFK, like we did with Teddy Roosevelt, you find yourself on the downside of what the empire can present to you when the people get a little too excited about living in a prosperous nation like this. You go from somebody like Teddy Roosevelt, who would have been the president in 1912 if the Republicans didn't rig that primary. Look into that story. And you end up with Woodrow Wilson. And then you look at JFK in what every story that I've ever read regarding 64 was that Johnson was going to be dropped from the ticket. He had tons of scandals attached to his name that likely would have, forget the fact that he had a hired professional hitman, which no one even denies to this day. There were scandals that were so insane regarding like land deals in Texas, among other things, that made him a $100 millionaire in 1969 when he left office. So you can imagine how much that's worth today, probably at least somewhere close to $500 million, if not more. He was in a lot of trouble. He had the motive. He had the psychopathy to do it. So it really doesn't surprise me. Yeah, I'm wondering if you have an opinion about this because, Oliver Stone has been on our show and I think he does really great work, but it does appear that the topic of Israel, when it comes to JFK, is one that very few people want to touch. Why do you think that is?
Well, I'm not in the JFK assassination research business. I make a living in a different way. This is a extracurricular activity for me. So I just say whatever I think is true. But if you're in the business, you've got to conform to the business demands. And I have a feeling if you look into the various the companies that publish a lot of the books on JFK assassination, you'll find it's possible they're owned by people that don't necessarily want Israel to be put in a bad light. And then you look at the conferences and so on. So a few people can make a living being JFK assassination scholars and lecturing and writing books and appearing at conferences and so on. And as our friend Wally pointed out, at least as far as Reddit's concerned, but I have a feeling it spreads way beyond Reddit. If you bring up any connection between Israel and the JFK assassination, you are uninvited, disinvited, unwelcome. Your books won't be published. So I think that's why, and it wouldn't be hard to do. You need to take over a few publishing companies. You need to be in control of a few conferences, and you can lock anybody out. I mean, Wally's certainly, I guarantee Wally is never going to, we were on together a few weeks ago, right. And great researcher, by the way. He's the one that found out that Rabin was actually in Dallas in November of 1963.
No surprise.
Yeah.
The one thing I've learned over the last few years, especially when we really started making a conscious decision in terms of how we were going to go forward politically, that we were going to just speak truth to power, no matter what the consequences are. What I have come to terms with is that nothing surprises me anymore. Which is why when I hear the stories about the Epstein files, for example, none of that surprises me, because I see human behavior. I've been around certain types of people where I can say, yeah, they're definitely capable. I mean, there are things that people say, actions that people do. Jen has said that at one time or another, almost every woman is going to endure some form of sexual misconduct on their behalf, whether emotionally, verbally, physically, in many cases. And to hear these stories coming out now about what goes on behind the scenes in the highest levels of society, it doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, LBJ, he's about, I mean, he was the Trump of his day. He was extremely brazen in terms of how he did business. He really didn't hide anything. And I would like to believe that when it comes to where we are now in terms of the modern era, in terms of what just happened, and we're going to get to that in a minute, I really do believe that the only reason why this was allowed to become part of the dustbin of history, so to speak, in terms of any type of reconciliation for his assassination, what ultimately resulted as in their years thereafter, is because it was in a non-information age. And so much of the media really was controlled by a handful of major publications, particularly major newspapers. Today, which is also why it's such a big deal, seeing what's happening in real time with a social media platform like TikTok, and how they have completely shut down any form of, the basic town hall conversation regarding an issue like Israel. Now, we're thankful for an organization, or the gentleman, Palestinian from Australia, who came up with the Upscrolled app. But you know what? In real time, they will show you what they will do to silence people. And there are so many outstanding stories regarding why LBJ had a direct hand in JFK's assassination that doesn't get talked about today. Even now, they do everything they can to suppress it. But I do believe my own two eyes, and I believe something as sinister as the wink between him and the congressman right after he was sworn in. You can't ignore this. Not when the empire's collapsing. When the empire's collapsing, that's when people start to ask questions. They start looking for answers. What's going on here? Why is this happening? Well, I believe that this nation's been on a downward trajectory since November 22nd, 1963.